Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. A dramatic Grand Prix in Belgium, but unfortunately all of the drama unfolded before the race had even begun. The FIA delaying the start to such an extent that Max Verstappen is not a happy man at all. So many drivers made changes today, going for a higher downforce setup to try and reap the rewards in the wet. Unfortunately for many of them, the FIA had very much other ideas. What do you guys think about it in the comments section below? Norris making numerous mistakes on the way to Piastri, re-establishing a solid championship lead. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's dive right in. This is Christian Horner, by the way, on the back of a horse. He was not there in Spa this weekend. And in Spa today, we were expecting rain. The last couple of days, we looked at it, the forecast leading up to the weekends. People said rain, rain, rain. It's going to happen on especially the Sunday. That's what we saw. The F3 race was basically a washout this morning. F2 happened, and actually, I thought the heavens opened at one point. I thought they were maybe going to red flag it. They didn't. They kept it running, and we actually had a pretty damn fantastic race in F2 before some drama at the end of the Grand Prix. Now, Red Bull. Yesterday, Tsunoda had a great day. Today, certainly not so much. Yuki was frustrated. There was also a bit of drama when, like, his pit crew called him in, or his engineer called him in, and he was literally already passing the pit entry, so unfortunately there was nothing he was going to be able to do about that. But Laura McKee, since coming in, did opt, instead of keeping the new floor upgrade for Max in reserve, put it on Tsunoda's car instead, and that seemed to help him yesterday. But today, unfortunately for Yuki, it did not deliver in these conditions. Now, Hamilton started the day. I thought this is a really nice touch, actually. He went to the Mercedes motorhome and had a chat with Kimi, we think, just to kind of reassure him after what was a challenging session for both of them, to say the least, yesterday. And then Hamilton took a 60-place grid penalty. So they decided, because they were way down the order after he made the mistake and, you know, basically went outside a track limits in qualifying, that they would throw a load of new upgrades, well, not upgrades, but they would change the suspension and the setup around the new upgrades. They would change the wing, and they would take a brand new power unit. So they took new everything, because if you're going to take a grid penalty and you're going to start in the pit lane, you might as well just change everything. That's what they did. He didn't have to start back in Silverstone, though. He did still start from the pit lane. They made suspension changes, and critically, they made a change to the downforce at the rear of the car. They slapped on a barn door wing for Hamilton, expecting the rain to hit, which of course it did, but expecting to actually maybe do some racing in that weather, which was not what occurred. So they threw on more downforce. This was theoretically going to be pretty beneficial for Hamilton trying to carve his way through the field, and he did a sensational job. I mean, it was scintillating watching him out there on track on the first few laps of this race, but then when it dried up, maybe far earlier than it should have dried up if the FIA had started the race at an earlier time period, then it would have been a very different port of call. And many of the teams today deeply frustrated as to their decisions they made before the Grand Prix backfiring. Now, of course, you've got to take into account when you're making these decisions as to whether, you know, what do you do, right? Like, do you expect the FIA to actually run the race, or do you not? That is a factor in play in your game theory calculations as to what you're going to do with the rear wing. But Mercedes tried to do a similar thing, certainly for Antonelli, right? They threw on some high downforce on him. And this was Esteban Ocon's rear wing that was, you know, very much unloaded compared to Ollie Behrman's. And there was lots of people saying, damn, like, Ocon's going to get absolutely farmed at the start of this race, and maybe should have been the way for the whole race, but that's not how it turned out to be. Now, this was hilarious. So Jos Verstappen was on the grid, and fair play to Nico Rosberg, man. This guy was not holding back at all. Rosberg was on fire. He goes up to Jos, and you can clearly tell that Jos did not want to be speaking with him. But he goes up to Jos and he says, like, basically, what do you think about Horner? You told the team that he should be fired last year, and Jos says, oh, I've got nothing to say about that. And then Nico says, oh, now you're quiet, are you? That's very interesting, after throwing a fair few grenades at that Red Bull camp over the last couple of years. Jos doesn't want to say anything more. But yeah, fair play to Rosberg. Just he pushed him hard, let's say. And his response, I think, is relatively telling, right? The fact that Jos is like, no comment, nothing to say, I do not recall. I think it's pretty clear that Jos had something to do with that. The race begins, or does it? So they go out for a lap to the grid at the start of the race. They start under the safety car because, of course, it was wet out there. You can tell, yeah, it was wet. The conditions were treacherous. This was this was when they red flagged the session. Now, they probably red flagged it because they knew that in about an hour there was going to be a clear enough window that they would be able to start the race and finish in one session without too much difficulty. Norris was said, look, it's not ideal for the time being. I can't see a lot behind the safety car. Can I imagine what it's like for anybody else? And look, yes, the visibility is the key issue. Certainly with these regulations, I mean, the floor, the way that it generates a downforce, obviously it's been the case now for some time, but the whole point of these regs was to make the air try and kick up off the back of the car rather than straight back towards the car behind. And that's kind of worked. But also it means that when the spray happens, it goes up in the air so far that it causes like such a cloud of spray that it's a real challenge. And the wet tyres, as we know, are useless. So there's also that. Pirelli were another villain of today, I will say. Like, in addition to the FIA and the stewards making some questionable decisions, Pirelli also have their part to play, I'll say. And we'll get to that and why that's relevant here in a second. So Lando was saying, okay, maybe we need to call this a day. And then they did red flag the race and they decided they were going to start a bit later. And at the time, that wasn't a horrendous decision. What I find very frustrating is that, like, they could have them out there on the wet tyres, at least doing some laps to then, I know that, you know, that means you've got to start the race and that means that the 3-hour countdown kicks in and that means you lose racing laps. But if you're going to try and have a race, you've got to clear the water off the track. And instead of doing that, they just have the boys sit in the pits for an hour and a half while the track is just expected to magically dry itself and they've got those tractors with the air guns going on. So this is what the drivers said, all of their radios, when, you know, the conditions were determined to be too difficult to race. Leclerc says it's a mess, the track's in really bad shape. And, you know, Max then says, after told the start has been suspended, that's a bit silly. If you just run a few laps, Jesus, they're way too cautious and now the rain is coming, the heavy rain. So, look, this is another issue with Spa and, well, I'll just go dive into what I mean by this exactly. I said yesterday it's kind of blasphemous to criticise Spa as a circuit, and I get that. Do I want Spa to go after Canada? Absolutely not. It's a sensational track, and mainly the reason why I don't want it to go is because it's fun of the Formula 1 games. But no, obviously it's got a lot of history. And it's a sensational circuit. Like for every other motorsport discipline, Spa produces incredible racing. That's not really been the case in F1 over the last 10 years. Is that Spa's fault? No. Is it F1's fault? Yes. But, you know, the reality is still the same. The outcome is still the same, that the racing around Spa has just frankly not been good for the last decade or so, I would argue. And one of the additional reasons for that is that, as we saw in 2021, and of course this year as well, because the track is considered more dangerous because of what has happened up Radion in the past, we run the risk here of the stewards being very, very cautious. And I understand why they want to be cautious. But equally, as probably most fans and certainly former drivers and most of the current drivers would probably suggest, like, that they were probably too cautious on this. Now, if you look through the order, right, I mean, Tsunoda says can't see anything. Like, literally can't see anything, says Lawson. So much spray, can't see anything. Visibility is quite poor, can't see anything, totally blind. So, look, I'm not necessarily opposed to them delaying the start, but I think that for them to delay it so far in the way that they did, that was, to me, the mistake. And it's understandable why they want to be cautious for Spa. Like, you know, we don't want to see incidents like we have seen in the past. But it just also makes Spa less appealing as a competitive factor because we just don't end up getting racing when it's like a little bit wet. And as I say, yeah, the visibility was terrible. They couldn't see anything. Hamilton says nothing. Alonso says nothing. Hülkenberg says nothing at all, which, you know, probably goes to show to me those OG drivers who have been around for ages, they've driven in much weaker cars, more challenging cars to drive in worse conditions than this before. And that's how Formula 1 used to be. Nowadays, that's not how it is. And also much more dangerous cars, let's be honest, than what we have today as well. So I thought it was interesting that Hamilton, Alonso, Hülkenberg didn't say anything, and Verstappen, who's also been around a fair while as well, as we know, is like, look, damn, these guys are being way too cautious about it, and now the heavy rain is coming, we're going to have a massive delay. Now, one of the reasons why I think they did suspend the start is because by suspending it, they didn't start the clock. So if you guys are aware, once the race begins, there's a 3-hour window to finish the race, and if it doesn't finish, then you have reduced points and all that type of stuff. So by not starting it, they were actually able to delay that start point, so they could actually run the race at a later hour and not worry about this 3-hour rule, but I don't really know if the 3-hour window should even be a rule in the first place, to be honest. I think it has its problems, to be fair, at times, but that was one of the reasons anyway why things were unfolding as they were. So then it became clear that in about 45 minutes after the race was meant to start, the shower was meant to pass and then they would be able to get going. And I think what frustrated me about this is I understand why they delayed the start in the way that they did, but to delay the start by another over half an hour after the rain had basically stopped, to me that was a pretty egregious decision, really. Because, yeah, the track was obviously going to be wet, but it wasn't raining anymore. They knew there was no more rain coming. If they'd have sent the drivers out there, they could have done a few laps behind the safety car, even on the full wet if they needed to or whatever, and then they could have got the racing going then. Because I feel like by delaying it so far, they were effectively manipulating the race. Like, in my opinion, the stewards should run the race when it's ready to go. And okay, I understand it was heavily raining for those 45 minutes. I understand delaying it. I'm not opposed to that idea. Most of the drivers would tell you, yeah, we probably shouldn't be racing in these conditions. But as soon as the rain stops, and you know there's no more rain coming, you should be starting the race right there. Because otherwise, I think the FIA, as a consequence, were the decisions they made changed the outcome of the Grand Prix, because there were many cars out there that chose wet setups. I mean, Hamilton was in the pit lane, Antonelli was in the pit lane, and they threw barn doors on the back of the car because they knew that that would help them. Little did they know that the FIA would delay the race by 35 minutes, longer than it probably needed to be delayed by. And therefore, that wet setup was great for about 10 laps. And after that, they were cooked, right? And it was the case for many drivers. So I think that was, to me, the frustration here is that we could have had a better race than we did. And probably we should have done, right? And as Max News says or whatever, changed our rear wing for nothing, right? Because slapping on this low downforce setup or high downforce setup to help in the rain, but then, the rain isn't even relevant because the stewards decide it's fine. They even changed this rule, which is kind of interesting, which puts the length of cars, basically, behind the safety car from 10, which we know has caused some drama, up to 20. So, which is pretty crazy. And I understand maybe why, for the visibility around this specific circuit, they decided to make that change. But it was definitely an interesting decision going into the race. So, the race finally gets underway. We have the safety car out there. And at this point, the sun was basically out. And yeah, the track is still wet, but I think we should have been racing 30 minutes ago, to be perfectly honest. So anyway, Norris lead from Piastri over the first couple of laps. And then the track, they decide to actually run the race. I still think they could have done a standing start here, right? Did we really need a rolling start? I mean, I don't know. I just think the stewards were very cautious in so many regards today, and to such a degree that I think it affected the outcome for certain teams in ways that they were not necessarily able to predict fairly. So the race gets underway, the safety car comes into the pits, lap 4 pretty much into the Grand Prix. And in the first couple of corners, it's Oscar Piastri who takes the race lead. Lando didn't get a great getaway out of La Source. He had a bit of a moment on the rear. And Piastri, again, I think this is what's so impressive to me about Piastri, is that he knew that if he was going to make the overtake and win this race, this was the chance to do it, was at the first few corners. And he was... Norris was understandably, given his history at Radion, a little bit cautious up the hill. Piastri was right behind him and, pretty much took as much risk as he possibly could have done. Meant that he, because you can easily in the wet lose time up Radion, but Piastri kept his foot pinned as much as he could, basically took more risk than Lando did, and that paid off. Now, maybe Piastri would have got him anyway, just because starting second, we know, is very strong, and we saw what Max was able to do that with yesterday. And we also know that Piastri was running a bit lower downforce than Norris was all weekend anyway, wet or dry. So that was probably going to help Piastri out today anyway, but I thought it was just impressive, the way that Piastri, again, in the same way they did on Leclerc in Baku, he just executed when he had to. He knew he had really one chance, and he took the chance. And from then, it was relatively clean sailing. Now, the race got kind of interesting a little bit, mainly because there was a driver making some serious headway, and that was Lewis Hamilton. So he started like P18, and he got past Sainz, and he made some spectacular moves really up the order of the field. This was Leclerc versus Verstappen. It was already pretty clear over the first few laps that, Max had more pace, but it was pretty much impossible for him to get past on the higher downforce that he was running as a result, and Leclerc did a good job of defending. But also we know that overtaking around Spa, is, I don't want to say impossible, but like it's very, very challenging. And we saw that even today with so many cars out of position and, drivers trying to make moves, Hamilton was the one doing most of the overtaking in the wet early on, because he was just able to have so much more grip and confidence on the brakes. And I think that does show some optimism for the Ferrari upgrades, right? Yesterday we were talking about some of the negatives. Today it's like, look, Ferrari have brought some changes, they've messed around with some of the setup, and look what's happened, right? Look what the outcome is. And they seem to have done a better job. So Leclerc said after the race, yeah, the upgrades have worked, it's just we're still not McLaren at the end of the day. So this was Hamilton making moves up the field. He got past Sainz, he got past Colapinto, got past Hülkenberg, got past Gasly, pretty much all in the space of a couple of laps. And then he came into the box. He was pretty much the first. And again, Ferrari strategy masterclass. But you guys can see the rear wing that Hamilton's got in his car, right? Like, there's a lot of downforce on that. And if they'd have had another 30 minutes of rain, like wet conditions, which it could well have been, then Hamilton would have been flying up the order, you'd imagine. But they came into the pits. Hamilton, around about this time when he was chasing down Behrman, decided that he was going to come in for the mediums. And it was basically the perfect lap to come into the box. It's such a long lap around Spa, and some of the track was already getting kind of dry. So Hamilton comes into the pits and puts on a mega undercut, really, on everyone above him. And he ends up coming out of all of this kind of interchange period far further up the order. Now, Piastri boxed on the lap afterwards when it was clear that Hamilton had made the right decision, and Lando stayed out another lap. So Lando staying out another lap was always going to compromise him, but if he'd have pit behind Piastri and accepted the delay for the double stack, it probably wouldn't have put him in much better of a position. Maybe that could have been an idea, and maybe it would have been better. But by staying out an extra lap, McLaren's pit wall for Lando decided that actually putting Lando on the hard tyres was the way to go. So there was this big battle happening behind. Verstappen was, trying to fight hard with Ocon, with like Leclerc was ahead, with Russell was here. Like there was 5 cars here, or 4 cars within half a second. It was pretty crazy because Verstappen had a bit of a slow stop. And then Hamilton's doing fastest lap. So he makes up the order, filters out in P7, and it looks like for a second, wow, Hamilton's going to keep making a big run, right? But this is the issue that we then run into. But this is the issue that the Grand Prix then ran into, was that, okay, now it's in the dry, Hamilton and many other drivers have a barn door on the back, so they're not going to be very quick. I mean, Hamilton was losing 2/10 down the Blanchimont straight towards the end of the lap to Albon, and he was in Albon's slipstream, right? So that was a big issue. And also just the fact that even with much more pace, overtaking at Spa this weekend was borderline impossible. So Hamilton was just doomed, unfortunately, for him to be stuck there for the rest of the race, and it was becoming very clear that he was never going to be able to get that move done. And there were really barely any moves happening anywhere up and down the order. Then the intriguing thing, though, is that Lando had gone for this hard tyre one-stop. And this is why I have a gripe with Pirelli, because Pirelli this weekend put on the C4, the soft, the C3, the medium, and the C1, the hard. The C1 was clearly intended to be like, okay, that can be your one-stop tyre. If you want to use the C3s, it's more likely that you're going to have to do a couple of stops. There were some drivers that did take another set of mediums, and yeah, Piastri managed those mediums well, but it's not like Piastri was the only guy to manage them. Leclerc, Verstappen, Russell, Albon, pretty much the whole field had no issue taking those medium tyres from roughly lap 14 until the end of the race. 30 laps around Spa is rather a long way. To do that on one set of mediums, I mean, that was a C3 medium, right? Like, that was meant to be a relatively soft compound compared to the hard. But yeah, I think Pirelli probably just got it wrong again, right? In terms of the fact that Norris didn't really have any more pace. And yeah, the medium was degrading, but it wasn't really degrading enough. Like, I just don't think it should be a thing that you can take a medium tyre, especially one that's offset from the hard so much, basically for this reason. For them to go 30 laps on the medium, and I looked at Piastri's tyres at the end of the race, like, they looked pretty fine to me, right? And I just thought it was all rather remarkable. So Norris knows at this point, probably, that Piastri is just going to one-stop to the ends. Piastri at this point says it's probably going to be tough, but in the end it wasn't really that challenging for many of the drivers to make it. And therefore Lando knew that he had to push really hard. And that's what he did. He pushed absolutely flat out. This is when he lost a bit of time. He got it down to like 7 and a bit, 8 seconds. Then he had a couple of lockups. He had a big moment at Pouon. There were a couple of issues that he ran into. And that was just him pushing and finding the absolute limit. And yeah, again, right, he's making some errors and people are going to criticise him for that. The big error really was at the start of the race, obviously. Hamilton also, unfortunately for him, was just getting told to lift and coast every single lap. Like, it was I think he would have got Albon without this issue, but again, it's the same as always with Ferrari. It's like, yeah, lift and coast, lift and coast. We saw it coming down the Kemmel Straight. They're basically like he's lifting off 100 meters before the corner. So it's just tough that Hamilton and Ferrari are still dealing with that issue. But Leclerc up the field did a phenomenal job to keep Verstappen at bay. And pretty much from there, nothing really changed. Unfortunately for Tsunoda, he kind of missed out on the pit stop period a bit, and he found himself kind of in no man's land, and just didn't have enough pace to get anything done. Piastri was on the radio getting told, look, you'll probably be fine until the end of the race, and that's exactly how it transpired in the end. So Norris, gave it a good go. He closed the gap a little bit, and people are saying, oh, well, if Lando didn't make so many mistakes, he would have won the race. And excluding the start, any of the other mistakes he made at P1, at turn 1, at the source, the other kind of small things that he did that cost him a bit of time because he was pushing really hard, it wouldn't have made any difference. If Norris closed up to behind Piastri, he was never overtaking him. There was just no way. The tyre delta wasn't enough. And, I mean, if Hamilton couldn't get past Albon and so many other drivers were just stuck in massive DRS trains, then there's no doubt that this would have been an absolute... it was Piastri's race anyway, whatever happened, even with Lando having a front left lockup, front right lockup. He was doing it all out there, let's say. But at the end of the race, it was Oscar Piastri who gets the victory. So Piastri wins, Leclerc was in third. So Piastri extends his championship lead now to, I think it's 16 points, which is pretty solid, especially after losing the last couple of rounds. Look, I expected Piastri to win here. I thought he was going to be the better driver this weekend. History would tell you that. I'm expecting the opposite in Budapest. So I think going into the summer break, it's going to be a particularly compelling championship. Of course, it still is. Max couldn't get anything done against Leclerc, finishes fourth. Hamilton with a driver of the day performance, which I think was justified. But unfortunately for lift and coast reasons and other concerns, he was stuck behind the Williams. George Russell did a fine job, but his middle sectors were just horrific. Like, that Mercedes is not built for this track this time around. Bortoletto with a couple of points. Gasly picks up the final piece. Lawson with a good couple of points as well is big for him because his teammate Hadjar is way down the order. But really the big talk, as far as I'm concerned, especially after the race, was about these conditions, because Sky Sports were asking Max, hey, like, why were they waiting for these dry conditions? And he says, yeah, we should have got going miles earlier. He thinks an hour earlier than they did. A bit of a shame, he says. And he probably feels like in hindsight, they should have done something different. As, he was asked the question, if we'd known the condition to be like this, if we didn't have to drive much in the wet, then, it would have changed our choice. And, Max says it's not ideal. That was Simon, his race engineer, right? So, yeah, very, very interesting. Intrigued to your thoughts, as always, in the comment section below. These are the driver standings after the Belgian Grand Prix. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.